The title theme of Elden Ring has a very similar leitmotif to the cinematics of Demon Souls. It's especially noticeable in this part. Here they are overlapped. In the intro cinematic, there's a particular phrase of interest.
In our home, across the fog.
Mention of crossing fogs and the like is not uncommon in Demon Souls due to the lore.
That is, until the colorless deep fog swept across the land. And those who dared penetrate the deep fog never returned. A lone warrior who has braved the baneful fog.
While we're on this intro cinematic, both games use static concept art to set up the lore, story, and game. They still have minor editing and effects, but Dark Souls 1 through 3, Bloodborne, and Sekiro were all animated videos. The Demon Souls remake recreates the concept art and animated it more, but it's still similar to the original. In both Demon Souls and Elden Ring, you have a tutorial introduction to the game followed by a boss. However, even if you defeated this boss, you're forced to take a death anyway to get you where you need to be in the story. Even if you manage to defeat the Grafted Scion in Elden Ring, the game will still force you to take a death afterwards. In Demon Souls, the Archstones were simply a point where you can warp to the hub, but in Dark Souls, they were made into a checkpoint where you can do a few more things, including level up. The only difference between Graces and Bonfires is that you can't warp from Bonfires at the start, but the feature would be unlocked later. Graces also have the same shape as humanity did in Dark Souls 1. Another near one-to-one mechanic that was reused was the Crimson Flask, the Estus Flask being a limited consumable that is recharged at the bonfire. The only thing different from Dark Souls 1 in particular is how you got more. Later in Dark Souls 3 you would collect an item to increase it, just like Golden Seeds in Elden Ring. On top of Estus Flask being as it would be, Ashen Flask were also introduced in Dark Souls 3, and it worked the same as it would in Elden Ring, being able to decide the ratio of Crimson to Cerulean Flasks you wish to have. Dark Souls 2 introduced consumable items that you need in order to unlock certain nooks and crannies. Sometimes optional, sometimes not. And Elden Ring brought them back in the form of Stone Sword keys. The way the obstacle of both the Hero's Grave chariots and Executioner's chariots work is pretty similar. You essentially have to get across the area while avoiding them with nooks along the wall, along with dealing with a few adds. The main difference is that one is a proper boss, and the other one is more of an obstacle, though you can destroy it too, with some environmental shenanigans. There's good evidence to believe that the Ulcerated Tree Spirit was an unused boss or enemy in Dark Souls 3, but if you want to hear more about that, or how this was found out, check out the Azula the Witch video on it. After your defeat, you are briefly awakened by a Maiden before passing out again. The level up Maiden is obviously a FromSoft staple at this point, but there are a handful of parallels that make the comparison between Maiden Black and Melina more direct and interesting. They both refer to turning souls or runes to strength, having dialogue during level up to channel said souls and runes.
Share them with me. Your thoughts, your ambitions, the principles you would follow.
Soul of the mind, key to life's ether. Soul of the lost, withdrawn from its vessel. Let strength be granted so the world might be mended. So the world might be mended.
They both have design aspects relating to obscured eyes, and even all the way down to having dialogue where they show surprise that you're asking about them.
Me? I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erdtree, long ago.
Myself, I'm only here to tend to each flame. I keep the candles lit and serve the brave demon slayers who are trapped here.
There's one more major similarity between them, but I'll save it for the end of the video. There's an arcane stat in both Bloodborne and Elden Ring, and even though the damage it scales with is different, it increases the item discovery for both games as you level them. The stance mechanic in Elden Ring works somewhat similarly on enemies as it does in Sekiro, except you can't deflect the same way as in Sekiro. At least into the DLC, with a deflecting heart tier. And you don't have a posture bar really, unless you count the stamina bar. This isn't just speculation on my part, Miyazaki has gone on record to say this was a bit of Sekiro's mechanics leaking into Elden Ring, as their development did overlap to some degree. The limb breaking and stagger system for repose has been reworked for Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, but it first started in Bloodborne. Obviously these games didn't invent jumping, crouching, or stealth, but Sekiro's usage of it is no doubt a good way to try out the mechanic and see how they work, as they weren't really a thing in any of the Soulsborne games. Who knows, perhaps they only added them after implementing them in Sekiro and deciding they were a worthwhile addition in Elden Ring. In Demon Souls, the mindless flailing undead enemies were limited to one area, really. It wasn't until Dark Souls that they became a reoccurring staple, with multiple variants on the enemy in the same game alone. With that said, I won't mention all the reused concept of enemies, unless they feel interesting enough. For instance, night enemies. Those obviously have similar classes in all the games, but they're also, knights. The scarabs are 100% this game's version of the crystal lizards, just sometimes dropping things other than upgrade material and the like. Demon Souls also had the lizards, but they had limited spawns and respawns if you scare them off, being more punishing. Prior to Sekiro, there weren't any generic merchants really. They all tend to be unique characters that sometimes just happen to have things they'd like to sell to you. In both of these games, the merchants are homogenized a little bit in order to telegraph that they are merchants more clearly, and that this is a proper trade. Power stancing, or dual wielding two separate weapons of the same class, was introduced in Dark Souls 2, and was limited to it, until Elden Ring. Dark Souls 3 had specifically paired weapons, but with no customization available. Some of the moveset in the Power Stance dual daggers remind me of the Blades of Mercy moveset. It's not one-to-one, especially since the combat is not exactly identical, but it definitely felt similar to me. Power Stance straight swords also kind of remind me of the Rikuyo in some ways. The kind of movement that you do definitely feels like it's kind of choreographed similarly to Rikuyo. But I would say there's less similarities than the Blades of Mercy and the dual daggers. This one might be a bit of a stretch too, but some of the anthropomorphic animal enemies in Elden Ring do remind me of the Lion Claw warriors, but it could just be that. The layout of the catacomb levels in Elden Ring are very clearly heavily inspired by the Chalice dungeons. They both have several reoccurring rooms and themes, they both hold the unique loot you may want, they both have a locked door which you can only open with a lever, with the boss hidden immediately behind it. Oh boy, I'm sure glad they brought back the Thralls, my favorite enemy. The bleeding status effect did exist in Demon Souls, but it worked more like a lesser effect of poison, which makes sense, but to distinguish it more, bleed in Dark Souls was made to cause a percentage of health damage when procced, and it's remained mostly the same until Elden Ring's hemorrhaging.
Hello.
Starting in Dark Souls, you could either farm or find enemy heads and put them on as helmets, which I certainly would love to do later on. Dragonfire or Akio's Flame feels like an expansion on the Twinkling Dragonhead stone. They both spawn a dragon head just to shoot fire, and you can move alongside it. And likewise, the Dragon Claw is somewhat similar to the Torso Stone effect. though with one hand instead of two. An excessively long katana has more or less become a staple in these games, starting with the washing pole in Dark Souls, and is currently incarnated into the Nagikiba, which do have some historical precedence. The land squirts remind me a fair bit of the poison broomer, both being some sort of mollusk thing that primarily attack with their status effect, which can vary. They can both also be in jumbo size. The difference with this one is that in Dark Souls 3, the secondary attack is a parry instead of a downward slash. There's also a few combat arts in Sekiro that have a similar hold stance. The Twin Blade weapon class were dropped after Dark Souls 2, but they were brought back to Elden Ring. The mechanic of being kidnapped is most famous on Bloodborne, but there is one example prior in Dark Souls 1 with Seath. There were invader type NPCs in Demon Souls, but they were usually already spawned into the levels, where Dark Souls introduced them more in the style of the online play invasion system. Do I need to explain? The guardian golems do remind me a fair bit of the iron golem, but obviously the giant automaton idea wasn't created by FromSoft. What mostly makes me think of this is the fur scarf thing around the neck. The main thing that sold me on these two is how both of them are used as slaves. The trolls to carry around the giant vault carriage things, and the giants for a handful of tasks, like opening Sen's Fortress and the boulder traps. Selin is a sorceress that was expelled from Raya Lucaria for her curiosity in certain class of magic, and was labeled a witch. It just so happens that Demon Souls has a character that was also branded a witch and persecuted.
I was exiled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria as a reviled, apostate witch.
I was branded a witch at a very young age, and have been persecuted ever since. Although I never had ill intentions, this black craft of mine is intrinsically evil.
Speaking of witches, Ranni the Witch obviously has visual similarities with Liurnia, but you could also justify it as both being inspired by the same image of the pointed head witch in media. The Bloodhound Knights being semi-feral knights crawling in all fours and still wielding a sword reminds me a fair bit of the Erathone Knights. There's also the Suspicious Shadows in Dark Souls 2, which are similarly feral, but have claw weapons instead, which is also fitting. For this one, the leap back at the end of the Wolf Leap reminds me of the first part of the Finesse. This one surprisingly took longer than expected, because yeah, there's no wolf enemies in Dark Souls 1 or 2, and in 3, it wasn't until the first DLC. With this in mind, you may wonder why I didn't mention dogs in Dark Souls. We don't talk about dogs in these games. This is a common comparison you see discussed online. Black Knights are a non-responding mini-boss type enemy that are spread out throughout the game, which are formerly affiliated with the leaders of the era. The main difference is that no Black Knight ever has had the true boss status with the big health bar. But if Dark Souls was as big a game as Elden Ring, perhaps some could be. Perhaps it's a crow motif, but to me the crow demons, and I suppose the Corvians in Dark Souls 3, do give me a lot of symbolism of death. And well, the Deathbirds are a lot more on the nose about that. While I don't think there's any one-to-one animation reuse or anything, the Karthus swordsmen do have very similar movement and flow to the Black Knife assassins, especially noteworthy in the side dodges. The Assassin's Crimson Dagger Talisman works identically to the Blood Rapture rune in Bloodborne, healing some HP after a riposte. There are many talismans that work similarly to Caelid runes, but I believe this is the only equipable effect that was introduced in Bloodborne. Alexander has a pretty identical character archetype to Siegmeyer, and later Siegward in Dark Souls 3, both being, well, not the brightest characters, and often needing assistance from players to proceed in their questline. There isn't a whole lot of lore for both of these to compare them directly, that I could find anyway, but the visual similarities are telling. Sekiro does depict a lot of apparition enemies and bosses in a purple or blue hue, but the Shichimen warriors remind me of the Tibia Mariners the most, perhaps because they both summon undead spirits and skeletons to fight you. The warrior can be found in areas where water is prominent as well, when the Mariner obviously has a water theme. The Kamehameha that the warrior and the giant skeleton summons can do probably helps as well. This one is extra interesting because in the 1.0 version of Elden Ring, this Ash of War is named Oath of Sunlight as well. Both of these games effectively force invaders to fight a player host with at least one friend, with very rare exceptions. The similarities between these two are minimal. Clearly they are both envoys keeping your goal at the forefront of your mind, but the main thing that caught my attention is this line of corpses for both of their kind. In the DLC, they introduced some statues that have an even more uncanny resemblance. I wouldn't even be surprised if it was a reused asset in some way. Master Hugh is a humanoid blacksmith with scales and odd formations forming on their skin. This, more or less, describes Blacksmith Ed in Demon Souls. They're both also very brash and to the point about their service.
You're a new face. No matter. It's all the same. Lay out your arms. Let's get smithing. Huh? I haven't seen you around these parts. What does it matter? You need a blacksmith? Show me your steel. If not, head straight for the door.
There's a ton of knightly armor sets in the Souls games, but aside from mixing from different sets, this Dark Souls 3 knight set looks the most like the one that Twin Husk sells. The overall aesthetic of Stormveil and Boletaria likely is inspired by the same kind of architecture and time period, but certain aspects of the actual level design in Stormveil absolutely scream Boletaria 1-1. The Brick Hammer definitely feels like that transformed form of the Kirk Hammer, having similar moveset, and especially noticeable when you do the R2s with the follow-ups. The Giant Crusher also has a hilt that's very sword-like, so there could be some inspiration there too. The grafting prominent in Stormveil definitely reminded me of the one reborn in Bloodborne, though I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't a conscious throwback. Black Flame as a class of spells will be expanded on later on, but the first version of it is the singular Black Flame attack from Dark Souls 1 DLC. This one is a more loose connection, but the Omen are a similar type of enemy to some of the bigger enemies in Dark Souls, such as the Infested Barbarians in Dark Souls 1, or maybe even more closely to the Harald Legion in Dark Souls 3 DLC, Ring City. Though it's really just a lion that has a weapon attached, the aggressiveness of the enemy do remind you a lot of a Sanctuary Guardian. There's a character named Darina in both Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3, both being blind, and they both have an association with Morn, Elden Ring being the castle where her father is, and Dark Souls 3 being guarded by Egon, a Morn Knight. If you attack Elden Ring Arena,
she protects herself with a rejection attack, which feels reminiscent of Demon Souls.
The madness status in Elden Ring is a pretty close match to Frenzy in Bloodborne, and in a way it's even more brutal than in Bloodborne, at least in a vacuum, because of the stagger after it procs. The Eye of Sauron tower encounter in Liurnia is also pretty similar to the Brain of Mensis when he first entered the Nightmare of Mensis. Both of these are used to mind control enemies if you're able to land a particular attack on them, allowing you to turn them into allies and attacking other enemies. This one should be obvious for Dark Souls fans, but the Erdtree and Putrid avatars reuse the general skeleton and a good chunk of the moveset of the Silent Demon in particular. Of course, they do still have additional attacks or expansions of them, and it's reused just as proportionately. While I doubt this was a direct reference, I get similar vibes from these encounters, adding a unique atmosphere to some areas. It's difficult to know for sure if School of Graven Mages was inspired by the Prisoner Horde. The Horde do have a couple of faces, and they are certainly inspired by Berserk, but the fact that they're both magic based isn't dismissible. The Knights of Zamor remind me a fair bit of the Pontiff Knights, being icy warriors with curved swords, and both pretty tall to boot, but also a little bit of the Dancer, with some of the dancing style attacks. Frostbite was added in Dark Souls 3, and it works similarly as in Elden Ring, doing a percentage of damage when procced, but also reducing your defense until it's cleared. Although apparently in Dark Souls 3 it also affects stamina, which it doesn't in Elden Ring. Gale's first phase in Dark Souls 3 has some moves reminiscent to the Misbegotten enemies, especially the Warrior. I don't think there's any one-to-one comparisons, but funnily enough, the Farum Beastmen share this flurry attack it seems. Visually, the Grave Scythe reminds me a lot of the Burial Blades transform mode. Given that they're both Grim Reaper based weapons, it shouldn't be a surprise. And who's to know for sure if it was a conscious throwback, but I do feel like they're close enough design-wise that it could be one. I believe Elden Ring and Dark Souls 2 are the only games where sometimes environmental statuses can stick to you, making it build up slowly, even if you're out of a poison pool or what have you. The Mushroom Crown design is undoubtedly a throwback to the monk's head wrappings in Demon Souls, and by extension, Bloodborne's Milkweed Rune effect, and the Dark Souls 3 Xanthus Crown specifically. You know you want to burn both of them with fire. The spells in Bloodborne were an item in your hotbar as opposed to a spell you can equip. And Elden Ring has some items that work in a similar way, despite there being proper spells as well. Similar to the Erdtree avatar, the Omen Killers share a bit with the Capra Demon, though perhaps not as much as a prior example. Both of these being an ice-themed rapier with a projectile attack sold me very fast, though Frost wasn't a status effect in Dark Souls 2. Anyone remember these monstrosities? Given there's only 4 in the game, and they are out of the way from progression of the game, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And it's not hard to see that Miyazaki might have a weird thing with freaky hands. A singular sword that can have 2 different elemental techniques feels quite unique to the series, and the laser one along with the Comet Azure feels pretty inspired.
The weapon art is also called Sacred Light and Flame, which definitely feels pretty apt. These ones are a similar concept, but in reverse. The Arumi is a whip that attacks as a sword, and the Puzzling Stone Sword is a sword that acts as a whip. At least mechanically, as the Arumi is sword-shaped as well, but the blade bends as a whip, of course. Dark Souls 3 was the first to have a spell that forms a magical bow, so hard not to feel like it's inspired, but of course in a different element, and animated differently. These spells work the same, the only difference is that Snap Freeze goes for a little bit of a line, meanwhile Mist grows from one spot. Another staple of the games tends to be having one singular giant hat, either worn by a character, boss, or just an armor piece. And Celivis's hat definitely fits the bill. He's even presumably a sorcerer, just like Big Head Logan. The Necromancers in the Catacombs of Dark Souls 1 that can revive skeletons indefinitely are used identically in Elden Ring, with a reviving commoner in like one dungeon, though the idea is kinda similar with the Spirit Caller snails, except for the variety of enemies. The animation of the Giant's Hunt is somewhat similar to the one grab attack the Shinobi Hunter does in Sekiro, though obviously Giant's Hunt doesn't grab the opponent. In Sekiro, the Mistwraith was a prosthetic art that allowed you to iframe an incoming attack and instantly counterattack from a different position. In Elden Ring, this was adapted almost one-to-one as an Ash of War, except you're limited to the vertical counterattack. This one is different enough that I don't think it's a complete reuse of a concept. Obviously the Red Wolf uses more magic than anything, but using a big sword in its mouth as a weapon is rather suspect. There's also evidence that the Cut Wolf boss from Dark Souls 3, that's likely related to this wolf here, was essentially expanded into the Red Wolf. The Mask of the Father in particular reminds me a lot of the Glintstone Crowns, so it does feel like a possible inspiration for them. There's a few loose connections between Fool's Idol and Renala that makes it feel relevant, such as how they both float down from the ceiling, having to kill a separate enemy to deal real damage to them, both can be revived, and of course, primarily being magic users. The imagery of Renala holding the egg also is strikingly similar to Filianor from Dark Souls 3 Ring City. It doesn't help that they both have black hair, but undoubtedly they're both referring to Angel's Egg as well. And of course, you can respec on Renala, which was introduced in Dark Souls 2. Anastasia is a direct callback to Mildred from Dark Souls 1 and other appearances, which is, in turn, a reference to the Black Phantom wandering in the Valley of Defilement Swamp of Demon Souls.
Overgrown beast enemies are a staple for Bloodborne, so it's hard not to feel like they might have inspired the giant dogs in Caelid. Demon Souls had some giant swords, but starting with this one's great sword, this general design was brought back over and over. Berserk. Despite the biology differences, the kindred of Ra do remind me quite a bit of the Brainsuckers, especially their heads. Both the Katana guard counter and the R2 of the Meteoric Oreblade have the same movement as the Ichimonji, and taking it even further, the follow-up R2 of the Oreblade could be equated to the double Ichimonji. I will be remiss to not mention that this attack, and the general stance of the Ashina arts, is based on real-life sword combat arts, seemingly closest to Kendo. From my research, the Ichimonji attack seems to resemble an attack called the Menuch, or the Men's Strike, the most. Each simply means one, and can be used as part of a counting exercise for learning the Men's Strike.
And the DLC would also bring it back with the overhead stance of the Great Katanas.
They'll become more common later on, but the Dark Hand grab attack concept is definitely reused for other things. In this case for the Lifesteal Fist most prominently, though Dark Hand steals humanity instead of life. The vertical slice for Moonveil feels like a more refined and, well, useful version of the vertical slice of the Frayed Blade.
And from the DLC, the Sword of Knight's Ash of War also feels like it calls back to the Frayed Blade, with the other part of the weapon art.
The Lion's Claw is one of the few one-to-one Ashes of War that is taken from a game besides Dark Souls 3. I mean, it is in Dark Souls 3 as well, as weapon art. And boy, there's a lot of those. But the animation started here. Artorias does this attack too, of course.
Flame Grant Me Strength and Power Within are thematically identical. The only difference is that Flame only boosts physical and fire damage, and Power drains HP, while the other does not.
Poison dragons are used very sparingly in the series, so it's not hard to make the comparison between these two. This one is a bit different in that the Lothric banner, you have to stay near the user to keep the buff, where the Commander Standard you can leave, but it only lasts 30 seconds.
The Starbeast movement is very reminiscent of a Bowl's, so there's a good chance they did reuse some of the moveset from the Blazing Bowl.
These two are identical, an area of effect spell that slowly hurts anyone who stands in it, including yourself.
The mechanic of fire repelling some sort of enemy has existed as early as Dark Souls 2, but it was also famously done in Bloodborne with some beast enemies, so it's an even more apt comparison there.
Obviously, stone gargoyle enemies isn't the most original idea, it's even been done in prior games, but the way they use both of these is quite similar, being rather tanky enemies that ambush you on occasion.
This one is pretty straightforward too, the only difference being that you can crack Leto's buff early by using a specific attack, because it is also on a timer, otherwise.
The Flamebend prosthetic attack combined with a Living Force follow-up attack, buffing your sword, is almost identical to how you use a flame attack, then cover your weapon in flames in Elden Ring with Flaming Strike. Jaren looks so much like Gale that people just outright call him Gale a lot of the time, since it's not an NPC who's very relevant. Not to mention you likely saw him first through the loading screens before learning his name. These giant ants serve very different purposes, but it's hard not to feel like it was a reused concept in some way. I'd be remiss not to discuss how Deathblight is almost the same status effect as Curse. In Dark Souls 1, if you got cursed, you did have your health cut in half until it was cured, but this was dropped in Dark Souls 2 as Petrification, in 3 where it was called Curse again, and then works the same as Deathblight. Both of these are enemies that are more so environmental hazards than traditional enemies, and the form of attack is not too dissimilar either. The angel pupa thing also helps solidify this, since it implies an insectoid-esque evolution, like the Star Beasts seem to go through. They both even have wings.
While you could argue this is also a reference to the bell gargoyles, mechanically it's a little more similar to man-eaters, not necessarily in a good way.
The vertical slice down attack with a following ground effect has become a staple of special weapon attacks in the series, and they started in Dark Souls, with the Drake Sword and the Dragon Greatsword. Obviously, both Astel and the Grey Ones in Bloodborne are inspired by Lovecraft creatures, but it's hard not to make the connection between the two, especially when they both have meteor and star theming. The area of effect attacks became way more common later on, but I believe this is the first one of its kind, in the Obsidian Greatsword. Even the animation is iconic. At least in name and some of the suggestions of the lore, the Outer Gods give off a similar vibe that some of the Great Ones in Bloodborne do. An extension to the Soul Greatsword, the Dark Greatsword, and the Azula's Moonblade are giant magic sword wings that have a projectile fall behind to extend the range. This may be a detail you don't know if you aren't familiar with the very hidden details of the challenge dungeons, but in Bloodborne you can get a ring in a random challenge dungeon that allows you to propose to the Valblood Queen.
Speak not those words. We have little need of a consort. Such a path would belike lead to further ruin. Thou art dear to us. We would see no harm befall thee.
To me, this definitely feels like a reuse idea in some ways, though expanded massively in the main story. The main difference is that the Valva Queen does reject you, although she does seem charmed by your persistence.
Still thy honeyed tongue. The thought alone sufficeth. Thy worth is too great. Now, speak no more on the matter. Honestly.
Obviously, the Moonlight Greatsword has been around even before Demon Souls, but the modern incarnation of it being able to shoot projectiles the way it does started with Dark Souls. In Demon Souls it couldn't, instead it goes through shields, which is still really strong in its own way. Now one aspect that's a little bit more similar to Bloodborne than the other games is that you can transform this weapon in a sense, although it is more of a buff than it is in, say, Bloodborne, where you actually change the entire state of it. This one is not one I realized at first, but both of these have very similarly shaped armor, and both carry a giant hammer. They even share a few moves, including that weapon's Ash of War. These are also identical, but the explosion resulting from roiling magma is much bigger. This one is quite obvious, even the wind-up animation is identical. You can't hold the soul stream until you run out of mana like Comet Azure though, it just stops after a second or so. While the moveset of these is a little similar, the main thing that makes them comparable is the fact that they have a transforming, extending aspect, making the way the Mantis blade opens up resemble the Saw Cleaver in design. One of the most obvious ones, the Giza's wheel, is very similar to the Whirligigsaw's transformed phase, both having a wheel that just constantly shreds through enemies. Now in Bloodborne there's no bleed effect or anything in this weapon, it was definitely added to the Giza's wheel, but I think the similarities are undeniable. Both of these are poison katanas on the shorter end. The Sabimaru isn't the first poison katana in the series, but being more of a recent addition, it's possible as a reminder of this concept for Elden Ring. That said, the R2s of the Serpent Bone look very similar to the Ashina Cross combat skill that Sekiro gets. I want to say Bloodhound Step is 100% based off of the old Hunter's Bone, both having a cloudy smoke effect when you dodge along with turning invisible. Now Bloodhound Step was way stronger, at least in release, than the old Hunter's Bone was. The old Hunter's Bone is more about quick recovery than it was about excessive iframes, like the Bloodhound Step used to have. Now of course the Bloodhound Step was nerfed recently, so it's not as powerful as it used to be, but maybe let's say Bloodhound Step plus Quick Step is something like the old Hunter's Bone. Hope this one goes without saying, they just use fire instead of lightning on occasion. Both of these rooms are obviously based on church rooms. The thing that makes it more relevant is the elevator on the side of both of these locations, working as a shortcut. Even without knowing the lore of these two serpents, it's hard not to make at least some superficial comparisons, both being huge snakes that seem to be larger than life. Though I'm sure if you were to uncoil the god-devouring serpent, it wouldn't even come close to the great serpent. Both of these snakes were worshipped as gods by the denizens of their particular region too, so they do have a larger-than-life presence even if they aren't deities. Probably helps that both encounters have a gimmick to them, while the great serpent isn't a boss and more of a set piece.
But even more relevant, the coiled up snake was also done before in Bloodborne.
The idea of skull-shaped spells I'm pretty sure was started in Bloodborne, obviously being very prominent in Logarius' boss fight and his executioner's equipment, and it was brought to this game through Rykard.
The way Lansax ambushes you reminds me a bit of how the Pursuer does in the first potential encounter. If you could kill Lansax normally in this first encounter, I would be more convinced, but he's scripted to leave midway if you don't have enough DPS, meaning you can kill it, but they don't really intend you to.
The Dung Eater and the Headless appear to both have influence through a certain type of Japanese myth. The subject matter is very dark, so I'll simply link a Azula video that goes into this comparison already, but this is definitely a content warning. Regardless, the two still have differences, so it's hard to say if it's a one-to-one callback. The hilt on the Eleanor's pole blade reminds me a lot of the black mortal blade that Genichiro Onishin get, but it's very hard to know for sure if it's a direct callback. The normal mortal blade doesn't have a hilt like this, you can't really argue that it's supposed to be both of them merged. Still, a neat similarity I found.
There's also the Spear Adepts in Sekiro that have some similar moves as we would see in the pole blade. The design of both of these are different, but they both have the unique feature of doing damage when you roll into something, albeit pretty small. This was also originally in Demon Souls, but it was a lot slower. This incarnation of it is identical to the Wrath of Gold, if the name didn't make it obvious. The Celebrants share some identical moves to the Undead Settlement villagers, and even the Bloodborne Hemwick villagers. The way the Celebrant items, from the Celebrant weapons to the festive grease introduced in the DLC, give runes back when hitting enemies, is identical to how the Needle of Eternal Agony worked in Demon Souls. These two spells are identical, both setting yourself on fire to cause constant chip damage on nearby enemies, but draining your health at a constant rate too. To expand on the Discus of Light, the Triple Rings of Light could be a take on Gale's multi-disc attack. The Golden Epitaph heavily resembles the Rune Sword from Demon Souls, but I'd even take it a step further. The Golden Epitaph kinda looks like it's very specifically rocking depictions of the old monk's throne room. From the throne with the bars behind it in the hilt, to the tip of the sword having a skinny figure with a sun-esque design, it almost feels like it could have been a cut design from Demon Souls or something.
Lay low the shard bearers and claim for yourself a great rune.
The primary early goal for Elden Ring is to defeat shard bearers and gain their strength. Demon Souls has effectively the same goal except for the whole game by defeating archdemons, albeit not spelled out as directly. They both even have a barrier that halts progression if you haven't achieved enough of your goal.
But the Two Fingers forbid us from venturing there until we've acquired enough great runes to repair the Elden Ring.
Both of these castles are the seat of the current rulers of the land and is a big turning point in their respective games' goals. You can even link back to how both of these rulers had a war with dragons to establish a new era. The larger Oracle Envoy enemies' head wrappings seem to resemble the bulbous Sentis crown from Dark Souls 1 and 2. It's hard to feel like the cane sword isn't at least slightly a reference to the third-eyed cane. The cane is not a sword by any means, and it doesn't transform like the third-eyed cane, but just the idea of the cane being used as a weapon certainly feels like a throwback, even if the idea is not original to Bloodborne.
The idea of your hub area being a magical replica of a physical location you can eventually find in the game started with Bloodborne. The Subterranean Shunning grounds do have a heavy resemblance to the Depths from Dark Souls 1. They both act as a form of sewer system for the settlement above it, but there's even some small details that they share, such as the presence of basilisks and rats ambushing you from boxes. There's also a similar loop in a staircase from Dark Souls 3 Ring City, where the level design implies that you should follow the circular stairway, but the trick is that you're actually supposed to drop down a cracked spot to progress.
Three NPC enemies, some of which are recognizable enemy armor and the like, though the Gank Squad is certainly much tougher. Fortisex being a dark dragon makes it inevitable to feel a comparison to Midir. The idea of a sword being the result of combining two swords in the Inseparable Sword was also done in Demon Souls with the Northern Regalia, though it isn't a fleshed out mechanic in Elden Ring. Demon Souls actually had you combine two different swords together, and it helps that they're both great swords. Albeit not nearly as bad, the Consecrated Snowfield's low visibility snow area reminds me of the frigid outskirts. The main thing that makes me compare these two is the little transparent veil they have in the back, but even outside of that, there's a few small similarities. This is more of a visual and thematic similarity, as obviously the heavy emphasis of blood in this part of the game invokes memories of Bloodborne. The white mask and the mannequin mask are both vaguely human faces that definitely are a little bit uncanny and freaky, so I wonder if it was a genuine inspiration. While the visual effect on it and things like travel speed are different, they work almost identically, being conceptually a swarm of bugs traveling at the opponent, causing blood loss when in contact enough. The dexterous lady boss archetype in these games was first prominent in Lady Maria, and Malenia certainly feels like the next iteration of that, even encountering both initially asleep or unconscious in a chair, though they do have enough to differentiate them.
There's also some similarities to Sekiro, with the prosthetic arm making a comeback, and Malenia being a protector of a child, just like Sekiro.
The waterfall dance that Malenia does is undoubtedly based on the Spiral Cloud Passage, both being a flurry of sword swings that send many wind strikes around the user. Honorable mention to the one mind combat art that resembles the very end of the waterfall chain. One of the most noteworthy mechanics unique to Bloodborne was reintroduced to Elden Ring in an interesting way. The rally system was tied specifically to Malenia's Great Rune, which blocks you from being able to use it for most of the game. Furthermore, it doesn't appear as effective as Bloodborne's rally, and it nerfs your flask healing, so it wasn't introduced with the most grace. The void of an area that was used in the Omen Twin boss room is identical to the Four Kings. They even had a potential mechanic similarity, as the Morgoth corresponding Omen hangs back a lot more and approaches you more slowly. When in the Four Kings, it does seem that occasionally the latter Four Kings will try to hang back a little bit, though it doesn't always work out that way. The long bridge in Mountaintop of the Giants reminds me of the bridge before the Throne of Want. Not necessarily the only time this concept is used, but this might be the two longest bridges in this style. This is 100% a reused concept. This one should be pretty self-explanatory, even if the trees in Elden Ring are not likely actual trees.
but similar concept nonetheless.
The Rivers of Blood has a very similar look to the Chikage when it is in its bloody state. And I want to say the bloody / Ash of War does look very similar to what you can do with the Chikage as well, both draining HP. The Rivers of Blood's Corpse Piler and the Godslayer Greatsword's Queen's Blackblade Ashes of War both remind me a fair bit of the Mortal Blade's Mortal Draw combat art, being a faster and slower similar looking animation respectively. Of course, the Corpse Piler is based on blood, the Black Flame is Black Flame, and the Mortal Draw leaves behind a mist that resembles a paintbrush stroke. Perhaps you could even argue that the second Mortal Blade's draw that Genichiro uses resembles and is close in speed to Queen's Black Flame.
And the last to the great giants of the northern lands.
Not only are both of these fire-based whips that have a fire effect when using their special attack, they're also both hair, so yeah, kind of feels like a direct inspiration. These two areas serve a very similar purpose, especially if you take into account the part where you burn yourself in their corresponding paths, or endings. And I mean, yeah, for at least this segment of Elden Ring, there's a big emphasis on the theme of burning or fire, which is seen throughout the entire Dark Souls series.
The last comparison that I want to make between Melina and the Maiden in Black is that they are both willing to give up their lives for what they see as the right path for the world, either at or near the end of the game.
Slayer of demons, go back above.
Thank you for guiding me here.
The Nexus shall imprison me no longer.
The one who walks alongside flame.
I shall lull the old one back to slumber.
Goodbye.
My thanks. At last, the end is in sight.
Visually, Farum Azula undeniably borrows a lot from the Dragon Aerie in Dark Souls 2. The way that you teleport to it after going unconscious also is a parallel to how you teleport to Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3. Another common comparison in the community, the Godskin duo borrows elements from both Ornstein and Smo, and from the Four Kings. The former by the design of the bosses being somewhat of a visual parallel, and ideally fought similarly by splitting them up with the pillars in the arena. And the latter mostly by the respawning nature of the boss, even having the thing where you can keep hitting the corpse of a fallen one to keep doing damage to the total health bar, though that's probably just because they are programmed similarly, rather than intentional. The ancient dragons in Elden Ring have a similar kind of design and concept as the stone dragons, in that they're both everlasting dragons that are made of apparently stone in some ways, and both prior rulers of the land, as mentioned earlier. Placidu's Axe in particular reminds me of the singular dragon you find in Ash Lake, both being passive, or at least at first for Placidu's Axe, which can also be reflected with the ancient dragon in Dark Souls 2. This laser from Placidu's Axe is 100% a reference to the one Midir does, just in doubles instead of a singular beam. The agility of both of these, along with the wolf motif, definitely remind me of each other. There could also be some parallels to Ludwig from Bloodborne, due to how they use a sword in the second part of the fight, but I think it's even less relevant than Notorious.
The state of the world changing as you progress through the game has been used in pretty much every FromSoft game from this point, but it started with Bloodborne.
The general idea of an area being completely covered in ash, and even the way it is framed, is very similar in the Ashen Capital as it is in the finale of the Ring City. Could even make a comparison to the kiln in Dark Souls 1, but it feels more on the nose in the former.
Speaking of world state changes, both the games start burning the hub area once you are at the end of the game, though it doesn't really impact much. The similarity between these two is mostly in the lore end, being lords of an era that desperately try to hold on to this era as long as possible, coming at the expense of many.
There's also a comparison with Queen Yharnam, being foreigners to the land we play in, our crowned queen, and our goddess figures. You could also argue you fight both of them as a boss, if you want to take Radicon into account. There's many similarities between the deity figures in these games, being Elden Beast and Elden Ring, the Old One in Demon Souls, Moon Presence in Bloodborne, and you can certainly extend the comparisons to Matir as well. The Talisman of Beast from Demon Souls and the Staff of Beyond you get from Matir double down on the last one, both being catalysts that can cast all spell types in their respective games.
The Scadutree fragment system is really close to a blend of the prayer beads and memory system in Sekiro, though instead of always being dropped by bosses, it's usually more so found by exploring. The possible throwback here is mostly just in name, but the Bloodborne Blades of Mercy, being the closest thing to daggers in that game, gives it some credibility. While having a more intense animation, Blind Spot in Elden Ring has the same function as Dark Souls 3, going around the guard of an opponent to do direct damage. They're even named the same. The Furnace Golem might be loosely calling back to the Dirty Colossus' general structure, simply a number of times bigger and fire-based instead. Undoubtedly they're both inspired by Wickerman. The tassels/rope things that adorn both the Horn Scent and Yahar Ghul armor feel like a potential reference. The Iron Mask Alsbach has in his set, especially with the grey hair sticking out from behind, calls back to the Cainhurst Iron Mask, or even more specifically to Queen Annalise herself. The fact that Ansbach and the Babbloods both have associations with, well, blood, also adds to this reading. Dancing Lion somewhat reminds me of Ludwig, in that they're both obviously humanoid entities that have many more limbs than they should, but are also an amalgamation of animal parts. The face both being eerily human while having the shape of an animal also feels very poignant. The jar innards look a fair amount like the engorged hollows from Dark Souls 1, and thematically are similar to the cramped caskets in Bloodborne. The incredibly dexterous primate enemies do feel like an intentional callback to me, so having back-to-back games with monkeys using swords while being incredibly agile is noteworthy, even if they're not named so. The fiery lava forge aesthetic of the ruined forges, especially with the giant stone pipes, feels very reminiscent of the Iron Keep and some other areas in Dark Souls 2. The Gurmgrade hammer that they drop, being an anvil weapon, is, well, done once again in the anvil hammer. The aggressive, dual-wielding swordsman with differently elemented swords, both having one covered in flames and one in moonlit magic. It certainly feels like an intentional inspiration, even if that's where the similarities end. The general hand-to-hand arts feel reminiscent to some of the temple art skills in Sekiro, such as the praying strikes and the Senpu leaping kick. It could also be calling back to the fist weapon moveset in Dark Souls 2. The jet black knight armor was very reminiscent to me of the gloom armor worn by Yurt. The main thing that sells it for me is the vertical spikes on the shoulders. That's a very rare touch in their armor sets, so it feels incredibly intentional.
The Lamprey and the Finger Ruins feel very similar to the Koltar enemies in Dark Souls 2, like Gulch. There's also some similarities to the Pisakas, and now that I've seen the Paralysis attack, the Brainsuckers could also be a possible inspiration. And of course, there is the original Mind Flayers as well. The orbs you cast around your character with a Horned Bairn is identical to how Homing Soul Arrow works in Demon Souls and later games, though the speed at which they track the opponent is closer to the Pursuers in Dark Souls 1. The dancing motif of the Blades of Rana has the same vibe and similar animations both to the Graveworn enemies and the Dancer's swords. The spinning dancing motif is also similar to Arena of the Water. While a mechanic like the Skull Lantern is somewhat redundant, now that there's torches and lanterns, it was still fun bringing it back with the Lamenting Visage, given the additional skill it has. The clone mechanic of the Lamenter boss fight is undoubtedly inspired by the Fool's Idol boss fight, which was reused in later boss fights as well, such as Crystal Sage. The main difference is that simply hitting the Lamenter clones once isn't quite enough to take them out, plus the fact that you're punished for not killing them if you don't manage to kill the main boss fast enough. The design of Jori and the Inquisitor enemies reminds me a fair bit of the Prowling Magus. I imagine it's primarily the Horse Skull with the horns, but given they're also primarily spellcasters with the giant staff, there could be something there. One of the most iconic and undeniable throwbacks in the DLC, the aging Untouchables function nearly identically to the Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne, which are even referenced by name in one of those flies you can pick up for crafting material. Though mechanically they expanded on the Winter Lanterns enough to still be a fresh and different encounter entirely. Aesthetically, it also borrows elements from the Amygdala and Garden of Eyes, particularly the head, having the encased head starting out, then popping out eyes like the former, and the more bug-looking eyes like the latter. The yellow torn robe that Midra wears feels like it calls back to the robe Old Monk wears, which becomes the head wrappings for the corresponding boss fight. The Old Monk isn't described as particularly sane either, so perhaps there's some underlying thematic influences there too. Undoubtedly, the concept for both of them is inspired by the King in Yellow, wherein the first story talks about the titular king being consumed by paranoia and insanity. The song for the boss fight is also very reminiscent of the Bloodborne soundtrack, which is incredibly appropriate. The aesthetic with all the giant coffins sticking out of the walls and such in the stone coffin fissure reminds me a lot of the Tomb of the Giants with a similar format. Perhaps it could also be paralleled with the untended graves, especially with the giant coffin in the Gundyr arena. The dropdown and arena of Pitucent Knight is undoubtedly inspired by the cave where you find Midir. The guillotine weapon the knight uses also reminds me a lot of the Orphan of Cos's placenta hook weapon in its shape. The way both of these are in the far right corner of the room before coming at you reminded me of each other. These two games also seem to be the most willing to use regular animals as enemies and bosses, so I think it's worthwhile mentioning, despite the fact that they are different animals. The Specimen Storehouse has a similar vibe to Aldia's Keep, at least in theory. The Research Hall is also something to point to, given the rising platform mechanic and the ceiling scaffolding. It was great to see the Fangboar get a promotion to a full-on Warpig. There's also some concept art floating around of the fight officials from Demon Souls riding a boar, so it's possible they finally followed through on this concept. An even more relevant comparison than the blanket deity one earlier, Metyr and Ebrietas both being abandoned mothers by their cosmos, who clearly mourn this fact, is extremely poignant.
Invisible flooring has been a thing here and there throughout the series, but Dark Souls was the first instance of it. The lady mixed with an arachnid is certainly nothing new at this rate. The original iteration was Quelaag with a spider, but the closest one is Scorpionish Nashka from Dark Souls 2. Given there's also a centipede in the mix with Romina, perhaps there's some potential influence from Sekiro as well. The way there's a semi-leap of faith drop down to reach the jagged peak is used all the way back in Dark Souls 2 with the Dark Lurker drops, the Ring City DLC in Dark Souls 3, and the bottomless hole leading to Ashen Depths in Sekiro. While they're quite differently designed visually, both of these are dragons that are almost more so crawling along the ground to have a lower headbox, as opposed to the other dragons in the series, such as Calamite. Some people said that this armor is reminiscent of Havel armor, but I would compare it much more to the stone armor in Dark Souls 1 personally. There's not only some visual similarities between Radahn and Vengarl with the double sword setup, but also some moveset similarities. There's some undeniable parallels between the brothers Miquella and Radahn, and Lothric and Lorien, both being a piggyback ride while supporting the bigger, more melee-based brothers with holy spells. This is likely a complete coincidence, but the twincest joke the fanbase made for Lothric and Lorien kinda became a reality with Miquella and Radahn. And finally, this long streak of attacks from both Radahn and Pontiff are nearly identical.